Dalton Keene believed that he was purchasing a cabin that is vacant. However, when he opened that worn door, a few of shocked his gaze was returned by green eyes from across the room. Within 30 seconds, all of his plans for his new life would break. Long shadows were cast by the morning sun through the pines in the darkness as Dalton led his wagon up the rocky path to what was meant to be his new beginning. He had used his money to buy the distant cabin. Final savings hidden from view from a frantic local vendor in need of fast cash. The action rested folded in his vest pocket, so establishing him as the proprietor of this remote frontier land. Following the loss of his ranch 3 months ago, creditors, this cottage was his sole opportunity to start over. He held the rein in his old hands, tighter as he got closer to the tiny wooden framework. Smoke was coming up from the chimney. Dalton felt a sinking heart. His firewood was being burned by someone living in his cabin, handling his belongings as their own. He had wasted all of his money, had departed from here, and he must struggle to defend what was legitimately his. Ascending from the cart, Dalton's shoulders were straight and walked over to the front door. The wood was sturdy but worn. Additionally, through the single he could see activity within the window. He tightened his jaw. The person squatting he'd soon discover that he wasn't an easy target for exploitation. He would lost too much and put in too much effort to allow what little he had left was stolen. Dalton pushed without knocking. The door opened and entered. The cabin was tidy, well-kept, and possessing feminine touches that caught him off guard. Flowers in the wild sat on the wooden table in a jar, and the air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread. However, what halted him was the youthful standing beside the fireside, a woman, her catching the dawn light with long auburn hairlight coming in through the window. She slowly turned and their gazes locked. She had a certain beauty that made guys I can't remember their names, but her green, the ferocious anger in their eyes warned she would be difficult to intimidate. She was dressed simply in a blue dress with had better days. However, she carried herself with subdued dignity, even though becoming enmeshed in something that was obviously not her house. "You must be the new owner," she said, spoken in a firm voice in spite of the astonishment that had briefly crossed her face. "I was anticipating your arrival." Dalton he took off his cap. Not sure why he feel obliged to honor someone who was practically an intruder. "Ma'am, I'm Keene Dalton. I purchased this cabin, and I possess the documentation to back it up." She gave a nod. Gradually, as though she had heard those same words earlier. "My name is Coral Lane, and prior to you." "Ask me to go," she said, pausing to meet his eyes straight. "You ought to be aware of that I am unable to." The basic assurance in her voice made Dalton's spine tingle. This wasn't someone's response who had been apprehended for stealing shelter. This was completely different. Something that implied his issues were simply starting. However, Dalton was unaware of, but why would a woman like Ka choose to live by themselves in such a remote location, or what she concealed made it necessary to leave not possible. With his cap on, Dalton table, attempting to maintain his voice, managed in spite of the annoyance growing inside his chest. "Miss Lane, I disregard the agreement you made with the former proprietor. I have court documents, and I now own this home." Cora shifted. Her hands were away from the fireplace. In front of her, clasped, "I get it. Your stance, Mr. Keene, but you don't know certain details about this site, not yet. Things that alter everything. What matters is that I paid for this cabin with funds that I was unable to afford to lose." Dalton withdrew the action from his vest pocket, then set it down on the table, in between them. "Whatever sob's tale, I've heard what you're about to tell me. Worse, I've lost more." Something in Cora's eyes, it flickered. Not alarm, but what appeared to be sympathy. "I'm certain you possess. That this has nothing to do with money or court documents. It's a matter of survival." Dalton looked at her face, trying to find indications of dishonesty. She did not appear to be the vagrants and scammers he'd met in the city. Her attire was tidy, her hair styled in a neat braid, and the cabin displayed indications of cautious upkeep. A person had been taking genuine concern for this location, not only utilizing it as a makeshift shelter. "Whose life is it?" His tone had softened, but he still asked himself. Cora was about to respond when both of them froze at the sound outside. Hoofbeats are rapidly approaching. Several by the sound of it, riders. The face of Cora turned pale, and she hurried over to the window, being cautious to remain concealed behind the curtain. How many individuals were familiar with you? Are you coming here today? She muttered. She lost all of her previous composure. No one. I didn't tell anyone about the purchase. At the window, Dalton joined her, and he saw 3 men through the trees riding a horse up the path. They rode with intention rather than carelessly. Journeyers. Do you know those men? She grasped the window with trembling hands. Frame, I hoped they wouldn't ever discover this location. The cyclist in the lead was a tall, gun-wielding man with a black beard belt with a lot of wear and tear. The other 2 stood like warriors at his sides, obeying directives. They weren't present for a visit to socialize. Miss Lane, Dalton said silently, what are you running specifically from? She faced him, and for the first time since his arrival, defiance broke down. My spouse, or more specifically Dalton's, the man who believes he owns me, my stomach fell. A married lady in hiding from her spouse altered everything regarding this circumstance. However, he could tell from her gaze that this wasn't about a straightforward domestic conflict. He's not the man who takes no for an answer response, Cora went on, her voice almost audible. Additionally, he has the most resources. People don't. The beats on the hoof were approaching. Dalton discovered acting as a buffer between Kay and the door, but he was unable to give an explanation. 5. He had been prepared to throw minutes earlier. Him out on his own. They're almost here, Cora muttered. However, neither of them discovered that the leading rider had spent weeks following Cora, and he had no desire to depart without anything. The cyclists arrived ahead of the hut, their snorting horses and stamping after a difficult ride. Dalton could listen to the leather creak as the men got off their horses, the jingling of their spurs up against the steps of the porch. Remain behind me, Dalton said in a startled voice to Cora, by his own instinct for protection. This he had wanted her gone in the morning, but now everything was odd. The door rocked with a knock. Leave, Cora, I know you're inside. The voice belonged to the man with the beard, and it held the power of someone accustomed to being followed. Cora's respiration accelerated, and Dalton sensed her dread like a real creature in the little cabin. What should I tell you? Them? Dalton muttered. Nothing. Cora muttered. Don't tell them. I've been spotted by you. However, it was too late. The 3 men turned the door handle. Entered without being invited. The leader looked around the cabin and found Cora standing behind right away. Dalton, a chilly grin appeared on his worn face. You're there, sweetheart. We've had quite a chase thanks to you. Dalton moved forward to obstruct the man's way. To Cora, it's private property. You're intruding. The man with the beard's focus turned to Dalton, assessing him akin to a predator assessing danger. The woman behind you is Marcus Webb. Mine is my spouse, and she will be returning home with, Cora remarked. I'm not your wife. Discovering her voice. That event was Marcus's words, and you know it. The smile remained constant, yet something his eyes twitched dangerously. The contrary to what the law states, the law is what issues here. Dalton sensed that his gun's weight on his hip, but the odds were not excellent at 3-1, particularly when he didn't completely recognize the cause for which he was fighting. The woman claims she is unwilling to accompany you. Marcus, the woman, highlighted the mockingly, has no other option. She is my property, much like cattle. Or property. The careless brutality in those Dalton's jaw tightened at the words. He would previously encountered men such as Marcus. Men who felt they had the authority to own people. No one is anyone's property, otherwise one of Marcus' friends. A scrawny, chilly-eyed man walked to the side. Dalton, we could just take her, boss. There are too many of these cowboys. However, Marcus raised a hand. Dalton is still being studied. You appear to be a sensible man. Stroll, nobody is harmed if you stay away from this. It's a family issue, not yours. Worry, Dalton sensed cause trembling in his wake, yet she hadn't fled or pleaded. Whatever had transpired between she and Marcus were resolved to stand up and face it. I purchased this cabin, lawfully, according to Dalton. Miss Lane is my guest. That's why I'm worried. Marcus's face grew serious. How long have you known my wife, guest? Precisely? The query was filled with consequences that led to Dalton's blood run chilly. Marcus wasn't only following capturing a fugitive wife. He was looking for explanations for everything he intended to her. Long enough to understand that she's refusing to go somewhere she doesn't want to go, said Dalton, and Marcus nodded. Slowly, as though verifying what he'd already made a decision. I hope we could manage this sophisticated environment, but it appears you have decided to meddle in affairs that you're not worried about. The slender man's hand approached his revolver, but Marcus had previously decided that would alter everything for each and every one of them. Marcus took a step back and pointed to his men. The words struck home. Burn it down, like a physical punch, Dalton. What? You heard me. Marcus spoke informally, as if he simply placed a coffee order. If my wife prefers this cabin above her actual residence, then perhaps she should watch what transpires. To locations that take in fugitive wives, the slender man went straight to the grasping a flaming log in the fireplace. Cora, Dalton gasped. Behind him, and he felt a break inside his chest. It was no longer solely about property, centered on fundamental human morality. You burn, you're wrecking my cabin. Livelihood, Dalton murmured, while instinctively heading for his gun. I gave this area everything I had. Marcus gave a shrug. I should have thought about own affairs. The third man kept quiet. Up until now, pulled out his handgun, and it was aimed straight toward Dalton's chest. The boss wants you to leave. I recommend you listen. Dalton's thoughts were racing. 3 armed men, a woman, and one of them to safeguard. However, something in Cora's previous words replayed in his mind. This wasn't concerning a horrible marriage. This was about surviving. Mr. Keene, said Cora, silently, allow me to accompany them. Don't lose everything due to me. However, when Dalton looked back at her, he noticed something that made him reconsider entirely. Cora squeezed her hands together, defending herself against her abdomen, and her loose-fitting gown was abruptly made. It makes great sense. She wasn't only sprinting for Marcus. She had something to protect, much more valuable. No, Dalton responded, resolutely looking back at Marcus. She remains. Marcus saw Dalton's eyes and went to Cora after it. When comprehending appeared on his face, his look became deadly. You believe that infant is stranger, yours? The charge lingered, like poison in the air. Dalton understood the portrait Marcus was painting would defend his actions to both of them. Among them, it's not his child, Cora remarked. She spoke, more forcefully now. Furthermore, it isn't Marcus, it's also yours. You are aware of that. Anger flushed Marcus's face. I own everything about you, as well as whatever is developing within you. Those words, casual evil, made Dalton made the choice for him. He had misplaced his ranch, the majority of his dream, and his funds within the previous several months. However, he would remain human while standing pushed aside as a pregnant woman was being taken by a monster. Dalton shut his hand around his rifle handle. She said, refusing to go. That's it. The slender figure with the blazing log chuckled. 3 weapons against 1. Are you certain about this, rancher? Marcus raised his hand, once more examining Dalton with fresh curiosity. In reality, I have a superior notion. Given how excited you are to play, let's add some interest, hero. However, Marcus's next suggestion would be tested everything Dalton believed he understood bravery. Marcus grinned, yet there was its cold. This is what will happen. Occur, Cowboy. I'm going with you, to resolve this in a manly manner. Fair. 1 gun battle, you prevail, I ride forth, never to return. Annoy Cora once more. Dalton sensed his emotions slamming into his ribcage. A fair battle, Marcus Webb was probably dead. Sentence, although the odds were better than confronting 3 men simultaneously. Additionally, when I win, Dalton inquired, Marcus fixed. Cora joins me at home, and you are buried in the pleasant, soft soil outside the cabin. Cora took a step ahead with a determined yet pale face. No, mister, I will not allow you to die for me, adamant. I'm not even familiar to you. However, Dalton was considering the protective approach. She had suppressed the fear in her gut. Her gaze upon Marcus's arrival, and the calm dignity with which she had dealt with an impossible circumstance. Perhaps he didn't understand her entire narrative, but he was aware sufficient. I am aware that you are expecting a child. That is not deserving of having a Dalton said. Father like him, not removing his gaze from Marcus. Marcus's mouth tightened. That youngster will pick up knowledge. Respect and discipline, just as its mom ought to have. Marcus's speech pattern. Regarding the fetus as if it were property to be managed instead of a life to be treasured, chilled Dalton's blood. He had witnessed what Marcus and other guys did to kids who were unable to protect themselves. You're afraid to face me alone, Dalton said. Stated, purposefully upsetting Marcus. That's why you travel with hired guns. Marcus's expression clouded, and he made for his soldiers to retreat. Empty the porch, it will not take long. As the two men stepped outside, and Cora took Dalton's arm. He is quicker than he appears, and he's slain previously. I have saw him do it. Dalton put his hand over hers. I was taken aback by how appropriate the gesture felt. Ka, what's the true story? Why did you wed him? Tears welled up in her eyes. She wouldn't let go. My dad had to pay. He was unable to pay Marcus money. Marcus offered to pay down the bill in return, for myself. As my dad was dying, I was unable to allow him to lose everything because of medical expenses. The parts came together, into position. Ka wasn't simply a sale. Into matrimony, she had given herself up to keep her family safe. And she was now the only way she could protect her unborn child she knew how. The father of the infant, Dalton asked in a gentle manner. A decent man who passed away earlier, he was aware of the child. Marcus discovered I found out I was expecting, therefore I made the decision that be his successor, if the youngster desired whether or not he is a father. Dalton gave a nod, knowing everything now. This was not about pride or property. This was concerning a woman attempting to defend herself, kid of a demon who viewed humans as belongings. Marcus's voice came from outside. Cowboy, it's time to go. Let's check your true nature as a man. However, as Dalton approached the door, Cora whispered a change-causing phrase. All he believed to be true about the circumstance. Dalton was interrupted by Cora's whisper. Chilly, Marcus is more than just my spouse. He's the murderer of your sibling. The blood in Dalton froze. His Samuel, a brother, had been discovered shot dead. 6 months ago, on an isolated track. His supplies and a horse were taken. The sheriff stated that the bandits were indiscriminate, but there were no witnesses and the case had gone cold. Takes the lead. Your brother was Samuel Keene. Cora's voice could hardly be heard. I heard Marcus boasting to his troops regarding the murder of a rancher who refused to sell his water rights. He explained that his horse, the man's face, and even the scar on his hand from an incident as a child. Dalton's anger clouded his eyes. The last blow had been Samuel's death. It compelled him to liquidate everything and purchase this secluded cabin. Marcus hadn't simply ruined Cora's life. Dalton's family was decimated. You're certain? Dalton's tone sounded like a snarl. He watched over your sibling. The one with a carving of initials on it. He showed me when he felt like it. Illustrate the fate of men who resisted him. Dalton went outdoors. Despite the rage, his hands remained solid on his rifle, moving through his blood vessels. Marcus got up, 20 steps away, calm and self-assured, while his two men stood on the porch and observed with a sense of keen expectation. Prior to Dalton shouted this. Tell me about Keene, Samuel. Marcus exudes confidence. The face wavered for a brief instant. I had never heard of him. A rancher who refused to sell his water rights. Aimed at the North Trail half a year ago. Marcus grinned now, sincerely, at last the politeness mask falling all the way to the bottom. That's Samuel, I see. Keene, a stubborn idiot, believed his values were more valuable than his life. Dalton was struck by the revelation like a physical assault, but it also provided him with anything that had been absent for several months: confidence. This was more than merely no longer defending Cora. This had to do with fairness for Samuel. He was my sibling. Marcus grinned broadly. Then this is even better than I had anticipated. I get to complete what I initiated. The two men turned to face one another. Hands, another across the sandy clearing, peering over their armaments. Dalton could hear the pounding of his own heart, yet there was something else underneath it. The voice of Samuel from their early years, instructing him to stand and shoot straight, standing up for what was right. Marcus on 3 yelled. First, Dalton's thoughts were obvious, concentrating on the individual who had killed his brother and frightened a helpless female. 2, time seems to slow down as both men reach for their firearms. 3, the clearing burst into shooting. Marcus moved more quickly than the majority of men Dalton has encountered. However, sadness and virtuous rage had become more acute. Dalton's reactions are sharp. After the smoke subsided, Marcus Webb was lying. His gun was still, and he was still in the ground, partially drawn. However, Dalton was standing over the murderer of Marcus's brother. The 2 surviving men left the porch carrying their weapons. Are already out? The slender man's Dalton's chest was already the target of the gun, prior to his reaction. The boss may be dead, yet you still took his life? That you become a wanted guy? Dalton's firearm was empty, and it would cost important resources to reload. He didn't have seconds. The pair of men moved gently, relishing their benefit. You ought to have taken care of your own cowboy business, said the third man. You will now be held accountable for your interference. However, prior to either man pulling their rifle, fire cracked from the triggers window of the cabin. The scrawny man whirled, and gripping his shoulder, he collapsed. Cora got up, positioned in the doorway, clutching an ancient hunting rifle. With ease and practice, the next shot will not serve as a warning, she stated, calmly. The other shooter spun around in her direction, but Dalton used the divert attention in order to dive behind Marcus, and he loaded his gun again. When he appeared firing, Marcus' final man was on his way to his horse already. Dalton, give him up. One eyewitness to the story might perhaps be effective in their favor. After dropping the firearm, Cora walked to the spot where Marcus was still. She gazed down at the individual who had dominated her life for several months, and Dalton anticipated relief or contentment. Rather, her face revealed just fatigue, saying, "It's over," she silently. However, Dalton was engaged in his studies. Marcus's physique and something didn't contribute up. You mentioned that Marcus retained my brother's watch. She gave a nod. He always wore it as a prize on a chain. Dalton stooped to look through Marcus' vest, locating the well-known silver watch that had previously belonged to their father. Transferring to Samuel, re-observing it, evoked a flurry of memories. Cattle drives, Christmas mornings, the Samuel had inherited it on this joyous day. However, opening the watch case, Dalton discovered something surprising. Within, paired with their father's initials, SK, was a folded sheet of paper that had been carved. "What is it?" inquired Cora. Dalton gently unfurled the paper. It was a map with Samuel's handwriting on it, indicating where something is located in the mountains to the north of this location. At the bottom, my brother Dalton had received a letter from Samuel, if something were to happen to me. Samuel was aware he was going to be killed by Marcus. Dalton understood. Knowing this, he concealed this message. The watch would be returned to me eventually. Ka stepped forward to examine the map. What did you believe he wanted you to locate him? Prior to Dalton could respond with the noise of getting close to horses caused them both freeze. There were more riders approaching the path, going quickly. The fugitive, he must have sought assistance, Cora added. However, when the racers came out of the, Dalton noticed a shift in the woods. Everything. The front runner wore insignia of the sheriff, and 6 deputies with guns. That's Sheriff Mosley, Cora muttered. He has been searching for me since I vanished, Marcus informed. Him that I was taken by bandits? Dalton examined the corpse. Marcus Webb followed by the expectant. The woman next to him is smoking, rifle, within half an hour. He was heading to be forced to tell a sheriff why he'd murdered a man who was ostensibly honorable, and why he was keeping a woman who had been abducted. However, the chart he was holding indicated Samuel had given him more than a hint regarding his demise. Sheriff Morrison got off his horse, his grizzled face slowly absorbing the scene. Marcus's corpse, the injured shooter crawling in the direction of his horse, and Cora holding the rifle next to Dalton. "Miss Cora," remarked the sheriff cautiously, "according to Marcus Webb, you were abducted," claimed he was planning a search. "Team," Cora moved forward with her clear and steady voice. "Sheriff Morrison Webb compelled me to marriage to cover my dad's medical expenses debts. After learning that I was carrying, he was violent when he saw another man's child. To keep my baby safe, I fled." The sheriff's Marcus's figure caught eyeballs. "And this Marcus Webb killed my brother 6 months ago, Samuel," Dalton remarked, removing the timepiece. "He retained this as a trophy. He was heard by Miss Lane, boasting about it." Morrison, sheriff, looked at the watch, identifying the initials as well as the characteristic scratches. Samuel had consistently grumbled, "I keep this watch in mind." Samuel never left. Marcus also attempted to go any place without it. To set my legally acquired cabin on fire, he threatened to murder her and Miss Lane, child not yet born. Dalton went on, "I demanded a fair battle from him, and he agreed to." The injured shooter now mounted his horse and yelled frantically, "Sheriff, they killed Mr. Webb in icy blood." He was attempting to save his wife. However, Cora had relocated to her suitcase into the cabin and came back holding a stack of documents. "These are the Marcus compelled me to sign marriage forms. Father to sign when he passes away." "You will. See the debt levels and the dangers mentioned in the hand of Marcus." Sheriff Morrison examined the documents, his face darkening. "These are illegal. These marriage paperwork are extortion." Documents. The injured shooter became aware of his tale was unraveling, which prompted his horse in the direction of the triangle. But 2 deputies had already begun to move to stop him. The actual query, according to Sheriff Morrison, this is what occurs. Dalton opened Samuel's map now and presented the sheriff with it. "My brother, before Dad passed away, he left me this, marking where he collected the proof regarding Marcus' unlawful actions, stolen rights to water, killed ranchers, families that were extorted." Samuel was, "I'm looking into Marcus," the sheriff said. "He apparently knew Marcus for months, would ultimately kill him, so he recorded everything and concealed it where only I would consider looking for 3 days." Later, using Samuel's map as a guide, they obtained a thorough documentation of Marcus Webb's offenses concealed in a cave to the north of. The evidence implicated the cabin, numerous dishonest authorities, and resulted in the retrieval of pilfered goods valued at thousands of dollars. The union of Cora and Marcus was deemed ineligible by the territorial court. The same court granted her compensation from Marcus a confiscated estate, sufficient funds to guarantee her child would never be in need. 6 months afterwards, Dalton was standing on his Cora hanging while the cabin is repaired laundry in the sun of the morning. The signs of pregnancy were already obvious, and she walked with the deliberate elegance of a woman transporting valuable goods, glanced up and saw him observing. This was the first time the baby kicked. Dalton grinned in the morning, still in awe of how his life had changed so drastically. When he purchased this cabin, he intended to stay, alone, grieving and re-establishing from nothing. Rather, he had discovered justice for Samuel. An innocent person was spared lady, and found that occasionally the life's greatest things are sometimes disguised as issues. "Have you chosen a name yet?" he inquired. Cora put her hand on her stomach. "If it's a boy, Samuel, for the man who enabled all of this?" Dalton gave a nod, considering his brother would have been satisfied with that. Samuel had always thought that decent people could find when they most needed one another. Observing Cora now, secure, unrestricted, and getting ready to introduce fresh life into the Dalton was aware that his brother had been concerning more than merely Marcus Webb alone offenses. A few purchases, he thought, proved to be significantly more valuable than you never thought of.